Rancher gave up his best mule so the Apache girl could escape. Her father arrived before sunset. Dawn stretched itself across the plains like a weary horse rising from sleep, its pale gold light spilling over the silent town of Red Bluff. Jameson Hale stood near the water trough outside the livery, his boots settled in frost-crusted dust, his breath fading like ghost smoke. He hadn't meant to look toward the post in the square. He told himself he didn't care about the ruckus from last night. But his gaze drifted anyway, drawn like a moth to the strange, still figure tied there, and something inside him stirred before he could stop it. Lozen Redbird stood with her wrists bound to the sun-bleached wood, her shadow long and thin against the ground. Her suede dress carried the dust of hard travel, and her chin lifted with a quiet pride that made the onlookers shrink back. She had been captured after wandering too close to town, the sheriff said. Trespassing, some muttered. Lying, others whispered. Jameson had seen the bruise on her arm when they dragged her in, the purple blooming beneath her copper skin like a flower trampled by boots. It settled uneasily in him, a feeling he didn't want to name, and yet he kept watching as the morning wind caught a strand of her dark hair and tugged it gently across her cheek. He tried to focus on the chores waiting for him, the broken fence line, the mule needing a new shoe, but his eyes slipped back to her again. The townspeople stared at her the way a hungry coyote studies a trapped bird. She didn't lower her gaze, even when they muttered curses she surely knew the meaning of. Jameson wasn't a man given to sudden impulses, but the knot in his chest tightened with every insult thrown her way, and the bitterness surprised him before he had time to hide from it. Deputy Marlowe strolled across the square with his thick mustache quivering, tapping his baton against his trousers. She'll be sent to Fort Sierra at dusk, he announced to no one in particular. Let the soldiers decide what to do with her. His tone carried the smugness of a man who enjoyed the weight of authority, and Jameson's hands curled slightly at his sides as he listened. The deputy turned toward Lozen as if admiring a possession rather than a person, and Jameson found his throat tightening with something disturbingly close to shame. Lozen's gaze drifted slowly across the crowd, dismissing each scowling face until her eyes stopped on him. He expected accusation. He expected fear. Instead, he found a calm resignation that unsettled him more than anger would have. Her eyes held a question he couldn't decipher, and he felt an odd tug in his chest, as if she had reached across the empty air and touched something he'd hidden for years. He looked away too quickly, pretending to adjust his coat, but her quiet gaze clung to him, almost daring him to look back again. The sheriff had declared she'd be marched out under guard, but the truth was simpler. Fort Sierra had no interest in Apache prisoners. The town wanted her gone before trouble followed her. Jameson knew this because he'd overheard Clara Beckett muttering about bad omens and vengeful tribes, words that fluttered like vultures around wounded pride. It wasn't justice that held Lozen there. It was fear dressed in the shape of authority, and Jameson felt a ripple of disgust twist through him as he realized the deputy had offered her no water, no food, not even shade. He walked toward her before he knew he'd moved. She straightened with a subtle shift of her shoulders, her eyes following his steady steps. "You need water," he murmured, lifting a tin cup toward her lips, but she turned her head away, her expression guarded. He understood then. She didn't trust a gift from the hands that tied her. He didn't blame her, so he set the cup at her feet, tipping it just enough so she could bend to drink without accepting his assistance. She hesitated, studying him, but finally let a slow breath slip from her chest and leaned down for a sip. Jameson shouldn't have felt relief at that small concession, yet he did, a strange warmth rising through him, as if her acceptance mattered more than it should have. He wondered, briefly, foolishly, what had driven her into these lands alone. She was dressed for distance, not war. She carried no weapons, and yet her eyes held the wary calm of someone who'd been hunted before, which made Jameson's pulse tighten as he stepped back. A sudden spat of laughter from Marlowe broke the fragile quiet. "Careful, Hale," the deputy mocked. "Feed her too kindly, and she'll follow you home." His grin was wide, toothy, cruel. Jameson didn't respond. He'd never been good with harsh words. But the heat rising in his face betrayed him, and Lozen tilted her head the smallest bit, as if she'd sensed something shifting beneath the silence. The moment broke when a rider approached with news that 2 men had been spotted near the ridge, men known for selling captives across the territory. Jameson felt a chill slip along his spine as Marlowe's grin faded. If those men were searching for Lozin, time was not their ally. The thought pushed against Jameson's ribs like the blunt end of a rifle, and he realized the town wasn't the only danger she faced today. Marlowe ordered Lozin moved to the storage barn until dusk, and Jameson found himself following as they dragged her, though he had no reason to. When they shoved her inside and bolted the door, the hollow thud echoed through his ribs. He lingered near the entrance, staring at the ground as if wrestling with himself, unsure when his feet had become so heavy with indecision. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't the sort of man who interfered in matters that weren't his. But something inside him, some forgotten ache, wouldn't let him walk away. He had spent years tending land that didn't love him back, evenings by a fireplace whose warmth left no imprint on his heart, and mornings waking to a horizon that felt more like a reminder of loneliness than possibility. Yet here was a woman bound and threatened, and he felt a fire in his chest he didn't recognize. Jameson walked toward the barn again just as Marlowe was preparing to leave. "You'll take her to the fort by dusk?" Jameson asked, keeping his tone neutral. Marlowe snorted. "If those traitors don't snatch her first," he replied, spitting in the dirt. "Girl's worth a good deal to the right buyer." Jameson stiffened, his jaw tightening, and Marlowe caught the shift. "Why?" the deputy drawled. "You planning to buy her yourself?" Jameson didn't answer, not immediately. He felt something rising in him like a tide he'd been holding back too long. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Yet the thought of her being dragged away by men with cruel intentions made the ground beneath him tilt. He turned toward the corrals where his best mule, Birch, stamped at the dust as if sensing the tension in the air. Birch was strong, obedient, and worth more than most men in town earned in months. Parting with him would cripple Jameson's ranch for seasons to come. But when he looked toward the barn, imagining Lozin's quiet eyes behind the wooden walls, the decision settled into him with a strange and steady certainty. Marlowe blinked when Jameson offered the mule. "You're out of your mind," he said, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed his greed. Birch was worth far more than he'd ever hoped to bargain for. The trade was quick, sharp, and irreversible, leaving Jameson with empty hands and a racing heart as the deputy unlatched the barn door. Lozin stepped into the light slowly, surprised to see Jameson standing alone. Her eyes flicked to the mule waiting by the fence, then back to him. "Why?" she whispered, her voice low and edged with disbelief. Jameson swallowed hard, unable to explain the tangle of guilt, loneliness, and instinct pulling inside him. "Because you shouldn't be taken by men who mean you harm," he said softly. She stared at him with a stillness that made the hair on his arms rise. Gratitude flickered behind her guarded expression, followed by something he couldn't quite place. Something hesitant, fragile, and overwhelmingly human. They began walking away from town, each step carrying them further into open country, where shadows lengthened across grass that swayed like whispered confessions. Lozin held the mule's reins lightly, her pace steady despite exhaustion. Jameson walked at her side, silent but present, unsure how to bridge the distance between them, but unwilling to leave her alone. The air grew cooler as they moved toward the abandoned cabin by the dry creek bed, the only shelter for miles. Lozin paused at the threshold, her fingers brushing the doorframe as if memorizing it. Inside, the dust glowed in soft ribbons through cracks in the planks, and the scent of old timber filled the air. Jameson offered her his coat, and she hesitated only a breath before slipping it around her shoulders, the gesture quiet but powerful. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The gratitude in her posture was enough to make Jameson inhale shallowly, his heart settling into an unfamiliar rhythm. She sat near the small pile of hay in the corner, drawing her knees close as she studied him with eyes that searched deeper than words could reach. He wasn't sure how long they sat in silence before she finally spoke. "Men were hunting me," she murmured. "If they find me again, there will be no mercy." Her voice trembled slightly, though her expression remained resolute. Jameson nodded, feeling his palms grow warm. "We'll keep ahead of them," he said, The word was slipping out before he could stop it. Lozen seemed to consider that, her gaze steady but unreadable. Outside, the wind brushed against the walls in long, sighing breaths, carrying the scent of distant sage and the promise of danger soon to come. Jameson listened, feeling the quiet settle between them like the first fragile thread of something neither dared acknowledge. And just as he felt a strange peace warming the edges of the cold day, a sharp crunch of footsteps pressed into the soil outside the cabin, turning the stillness into a question that neither of them knew how to answer. "You." The footsteps outside the cabin hesitated, as if weighing the worth of coming closer. Lozen straightened, her fingers brushing the floor for balance, while Jameson rose with the quiet stiffness of a man ready to shield without knowing from what. The fading light painted the doorway in a pale amber glow, and the figure that finally appeared stood tall and unyielding, his shadow stretching long across the hard dirt. For a heartbeat Jameson thought danger had found them, but Lozen gasped so softly it almost vanished into the dusk, and the look in her eyes told him this wasn't an enemy at all. A man with braided hair streaked with silver stepped into the dim cabin, his face carved with years of leadership and loss. His presence filled the room with a gravity that made Jameson's pulse steady into something more cautious than afraid. Lozen rose slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she whispered a single word that trembled with memory. "Father." Chief Takota didn't rush to her. He studied her closely, his gaze sliding to the borrowed coat around her shoulders, then to Jameson, whose stance hardened instinctively under the scrutiny. The silence between the three of them felt thick enough to hold in both palms, waiting for someone to cut through it. Takota stepped forward, the leather fringe on his sleeves swaying with controlled power. "You kept my daughter from the men hunting her," he said, his voice deep enough to rattle the dust in the cracks of the walls. His words weren't gratitude, they were a test. Jameson met his gaze without flinching, though he felt the weight of the older man's judgment settle on every part of his being. Takota's eyes narrowed as if trying to measure the truth of him. Lozen moved closer, her hand lightly touching her father's arm as though she feared the next breath might ignite something irrevocable. Her father turned to her, and the sternness in his expression softened for a brief moment, a flicker of grief that made Lozen inhale sharply. Jameson saw then that she had not been merely lost. She had been missed with a depth that widened the space between every heartbeat in the room. But Takota's attention shifted back to Jameson, sharpening again like flint struck against steel. "A mule," he said quietly. "My scouts saw the trade. You gave your strongest animal for her freedom." Jameson nodded once, unsure how to explain the tangled reasons that still felt too raw to voice. Takota's voice dropped lower. Why would a rancher give up something so valuable for a woman not his own? Lozen's breath hitched at the shape of those words, and Jameson felt heat rise into his chest, not shame this time, but a fierce desire to speak plainly. "Because she didn't deserve what the town planned for her," he said, his voice steady though the truth pulled at him in places he'd rather keep hidden. "And because no one else was going to stop them." Takota studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching close enough to break. Then the chief lifted two fingers and gestured for Lozen to stand between them, as though her presence formed the bridge for whatever came next. Lozen moved to Jameson, her steps small but firm, and stood at his side with a quiet resolve that made his stomach tighten. "Father," she said softly, "this man risked what he owned and risked his peace to keep me safe." Her voice didn't tremble now. It carried conviction as steady as the earth beneath them. Takota's gaze flickered between their faces, and something unreadable passed through his eyes before settling into a solemn, heavy decision. "If he means to stand at your side," Takota murmured, "then let him do it before the eyes of the sky." Before Jameson could understand the full implication, Takota stepped past him and walked outside into the soft colors of the evening. Lozen followed with a faint, hopeful breath, and Jameson found himself drawn after them, the lingering uncertainty in his chest swallowed by something dangerously close to longing. The plain stretched wide, with fading sunlight pooling across the earth. A light breeze moved through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dust and sweet sage. Takota lifted a carved wooden bowl filled with clean water, holding it between his hands with a reverence that made Jameson's breath grow shallow. Lozen stood across from Jameson, her eyes warm yet guarded, as though she feared waking from a dream too fragile to survive the night. Dakota placed the bowl between them and murmured words Jameson didn't understand, but the tone, deep, melodic, ancient, settled into his bones. Lozen extended her hands first. Jameson reached out slowly, afraid to want too much, yet unable to hold back. When their palms touched above the water, every tension in his chest fell quiet. Her fingers were warm, steady, carrying a strength that surprised him. Dakota dipped a feather into the water and brushed it across their joined hands, letting droplets fall like tiny silver beads catching the last light. "The earth witnesses," he said. "The sky listens. Let truth bind you if you choose one another." Lozen looked at Jameson fully then, her gaze steady and open in a way she had never allowed before. "I choose," she whispered, her voice fragile yet fierce. Jameson felt something inside him unravel with relief, his voice escaping him softly. "I choose," he echoed. Dakota nodded once, sealing the vow with the simplest gesture, a hand over his heart, before stepping back to let them breathe in the new shape of their bond. Lozen's expression warmed into something luminous. She leaned in, lifting her hands to his face with a tenderness that made Jameson sway. Her lips brushed his with a quiet surety, not rushed, not uncertain, but careful in a way that soothed the ache he'd carried for years. His hands closed gently around her waist, drawing her close enough to feel the rise of her breath, the subtle tremor of connection that deepened with every heartbeat. But before the kiss could settle fully, a shout split the evening air. Jameson turned sharply, Lozen's fingers still resting near his jaw, and saw dust roiling on the horizon. Shapes rose from the shifting haze, riders. Fast, purposeful, angry. Dakota stepped forward instantly, his stance grounded, his presence suddenly warlike. "The men who hunted you," he murmured to Lozen, and the warning in his tone struck the ground like a hammer. Jameson felt her grip tighten on his sleeve, the fear in her eyes mirrored by a resolve that made his breath catch. The riders swept closer, 5 in total, the kind of men whose greed was written in the reckless pull of their reins. Their leader, a scar running from cheek to jaw, pointed at Lozen with a gun already cocked. "She's ours," he shouted. "Hand her over, rancher. We got business with that girl." Jameson stepped in front of Lozen without thinking. Dakota's warriors emerged from the shadows near the ridge, bows raised, spears angled, forming a quiet circle of defiance that forced the riders to slow their approach. The leader's eyes darted uneasily at the sudden shift in odds, but his arrogance held firm for a moment longer. "You traded her," he growled at Jameson. "She's a price, not a bride." The insult cut deep, but Jameson refused to move. His voice rose with a conviction he didn't know he possessed. "She's my wife," he said, the words ringing clear through the fading light. "And no one will take her from me." Lozen gasped softly behind him as if the truth of that declaration pierced through some hidden wound, and Dakota's gaze hardened with pride. The riders hesitated, their bravado shrinking beneath the weight of a tribe united. Dakota stepped beside Jameson, shoulder to shoulder, his voice a low thunder. "Leave now," he warned, "or the ground will remember your blood." The riders exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. Their leader tried to muster his earlier swagger, but failed when he saw Lozen clutch Jameson's arm with a courage that unsettled even him. Finally, with a curse thrown to the wind, he yanked his horse's reins and turned. One by one the riders followed, their silhouettes swallowed by dusk as the quiet reclaimed the plains. The victory left Jameson breathless. Lozen turned to him with tears warming her lashes, her hand rising to his cheek in a gesture of reverence and yearning. He leaned into her touch instinctively, letting himself feel the full weight of her presence now that danger had passed. "You stood for me," she whispered, voice trembling with wonder. "Not because of debt, not because of fear, but because your heart chose me." Jameson closed his eyes briefly, savoring the gentleness of her words before pressing a soft kiss to her brow. Dakota approached with a slow nod, the pride in his gaze tempered with relief. Lozen stepped into her father's brief embrace, but her eyes found Jameson again almost instantly, as if afraid he might vanish with the wind. When she returned to his side, she rested her forehead against his, and the world seemed to soften into something warm enough to carry them both. The three of them stood together as dusk deepened into a velvety indigo, the land holding its breath as if honoring a promise sealed by courage. Later, as the moon climbed low and gentle over the sleeping plains, Jameson and Lozen walked hand in hand toward the quiet cabin that had sheltered their first fragile bond. The night drew around them like a woven blanket, soft and familiar, and Jameson felt a peace he had never known nestle itself along the edges of his heart. Lozen leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper, as she said, "The world tried to take everything from us, but it gave us each other." Jameson exhaled slowly, letting her words melt into him with the weight of truth long sought and finally found. The old soul in him, tired, scarred, wandering, felt anchored at last, and as they stepped into the warm shadows of the doorway, he knew they were stepping into more than shelter. They were stepping into a life they would build with quiet courage, shared tenderness, and the stubborn, enduring flame of a love they never expected. And if one listened closely to the wind passing over the plains that night, it whispered the same truth that had carried them both to this moment. Sometimes a single act of bravery can rewrite the story of two hearts forever, leaving behind an echo that lingers long after the writers fade into darkness.